Hey guys, this is Austin, and welcome to the Ultimate Xbox Comparison.
When I started here back in 2000, the most recent console that we were all playing was Dreamcast. We got it on $99.99. In many ways, there's a lot of special spiritual connections between the Dreamcast and the original Xbox. It ran actually Windows CE as an operating system. We had partnered with a lot of the folks at Sega to bring a lot of that content also to Xbox, and we were learning a lot from them.
It's thinking.
The Sega Dreamcast was the first time that a version of Windows was found on a home console. The inclusion of Windows CE meant that developers had options for much more advanced development tools from the PC, such as DirectX. The problem here was that Sega had their own custom development tool, which in a lot of ways actually made it much simpler for developers to take advantage of the limited resources that were available on the Dreamcast. The titles that did take advantage of Windows CE were pretty cool though. We're talking Tomb Raider, the original Rainbow Six, as well as Resident Evil 2. The Dreamcast didn't exactly set the world on fire, however it did plant the seed of an idea over at Microsoft to start their own console business. Despite having high-profile PC exclusives such as Age of Empires as well as Microsoft Flight Simulator, Bill Gates was nervous about the upcoming success, or potential success rather, of the Sony PlayStation 2. When Seamus Blackey, a graphics programmer at Microsoft, approached Gates about an idea for their own console, it was very quickly greenlit. Blackey led a small group of people at Microsoft in 1998 to start working on the Midway project, which, fun fact, was named after the Battle of Midway, where the US decisively beat the Japanese, aka console wars.
Well, there was a small group of folks that had this big idea that had worked on DirectX, technology on the PC side, and said, hey, what if we took this technology, and Microsoft had made a bunch of PC games, we took that technology, we built it into a plug-and-play kind of appliance-like console for the living room. And we felt like we had the tech, we had the operating system capabilities, we had the online networking capabilities, we actually had game studios, so we had a lot of the internal ingredients to make it happen.
Other PC tech included using an internal hard drive, something that hadn't been done on consoles yet, as well as taking advantage of an internet connection which would work right out of the box. In the end, Microsoft opted to load the Xbox up with a custom version of Windows 2000 for the operating system, as well as running DirectX for the actual games themselves. Now, the DirectX portion of this actually is a pretty important point. So not only did this have a ton of different names when it was being developed, but the most common one was the DirectX box, which of course was shortened to Xbox, a much cleaner name. The Xbox was officially announced at GDC in March of 2000, coincidentally about the same time that the Sony PlayStation 2 went on sale in Japan. With that console quickly looking to become a juggernaut, there was a huge uphill battle for the Xbox to go. I mean, it's sure, of course, it's Microsoft and this huge company, but it's easy to forget not only just how difficult and expensive it is to create a console, but of course how expensive it is to spend all this marketing dollars and all this stuff to get people on board to actually buy your brand new Xbox. To combat this, Microsoft aggressively marketed the Xbox in the run-up to E3 of 2000. Now at the show there, they met a developer which would end up completely changing the future of the Xbox. It was Bungie, and very quickly they purchased the studio for $30 million, and the Xbox had its killer app. Now, Bungie had been working on Halo since 1997, and it had a very, very long lifespan to get to the point where it actually launched on the Xbox. First of all, it started out as a real-time strategy game, which then morphed into a third-person shooter, and finally it landed as a first-person shooter, which of course really kind of revolutionized the genre. Now, of course, today, Halo is synonymous with Xbox, but back in 1999, it was good old Steve Jobs at Macworld who was showing off the brand new Bungie title, Halo.
This game is going to ship early next year from Bungie, and this is the first time anybody has ever seen it. It's the first time they've debuted it. And so I'm very happy to welcome on the stage Jason Jones, who is the co-founder of Bungie and the Halo project lead. Halo is the name of this game, and we're going to see for the first time Halo.
Now, this was originally going to be a Mac title, and in fact it did actually ship on the Mac, but even though this version was a little bit rough, you can still see a lot of similarities between this and the final version which shipped on Xbox. Bill Gates revealed the final Xbox design at CES in 2001, and he didn't do it alone. He had a little bit of help from The Rock. And no, not like The Rock as we know him today. I'm talking The Rock in full character, because 2001 was a really weird time.
And Bill Gates, you have some pretty cool catchphrases as well. What are some of your favorites?
My favorite is probably writing hardcore C to create slick type code.
The Xbox officially went on sale at midnight on November 15th, 2001 here in the United States, and it followed up in early 2002 in other parts of the world such as Europe as well as Asia. And it didn't exactly, well, catch on anywhere else around the world. By the end of its life cycle, the Xbox had only sold a mere 450,000 units in Japan and only about 2 million in the entire Asia Pacific region. That was a massive failure, although it did perform a little bit better in Europe, where they sold a grand total of around 6 million Xboxes. Halo really is the reason that they sold the Xbox at all. In the first few months of being on sale, they sold over 1 million copies of Halo, which is a lot, especially by 2001 standards.
You know, the team had a big vision and had a lot of crazy ideas. And it was just fun to like kind of figure out how do we pull that all off. And then content, you know, I remember when we first showed Halo for the first time at E3, original Halo, Combat Evolved, you know, people were kind of like, I'm not sure. I mean, first-person shooters really hadn't existed with a controller, and mapping the keyboard and mouse controllers to a controller was a new thing. People took a little while to get used to it, but then as soon as we launched, it was clear that we had something special. But not only did Halo take off, but then when we launched Xbox Live the next holiday, it really took off from there.
Less than a year after release, Microsoft did give the Xbox a price cut, going from $300 down to $200. Now this meant that they could better compete with the GameCube as well as hopefully with the PlayStation 2, but it did mean that Microsoft was selling the console at a loss, and at the end of the day, no console of this generation could even come close to the kind of sales numbers that the PlayStation 2 set down. Inside, the Xbox was very clearly the most powerful console of this generation, and that is almost entirely due to the fact that they did opt to go for a very PC-like architecture. This uses a custom Intel Pentium 3 CPU clocked at 733 MHz, 64 megabytes of DDR SRAM, as well as a very customized NVIDIA GPU. Now this meant that this had some real performance, especially in games such as Project Gotham Racing as well as Halo 2, which performed well and looked great. However, it meant the backwards compatibility for future generations was a little bit more difficult, but we'll get into that just a little bit later. Now the Xbox did use a DVD drive unlike the GameCube and Dreamcast. However, unlike the PlayStation 2, you had to purchase a dongle as well as a remote to actually play any kind of DVD content. If you put a DVD in standardly, it just doesn't really do anything. So that was a pretty big negative point in that you had to go buy extra stuff, whereas lots of people bought PS2s purely as DVD players. This also opened up a world of homebrew and piracy issues for the Xbox. Now Microsoft did redesign the internal components of the Xbox a couple times to try to get around people who are cracking it, but generally speaking, this even to this day is still a very popular emulation machine, and there are even like flash drives that you can buy that will allow you to completely open it up for homebrew or whatever you want to do on it. One of the more unique and controversial parts of the original Xbox was the controller it shipped with, the Duke. Now this thing was absolutely massive, and while some people do swear by it even to this day, for the most part it was a pretty major failure, especially considering that they actually developed a secondary controller called the S for the Japanese market, which they subsequently used to ship everywhere in the world by 2002. So the Duke was cool, but it didn't exactly last long. And also, have you seen how big this thing is? One slight advantage of the Xbox controller is that it did introduce the idea of a breakaway cable. So say your annoying roommate decides to kick your Xbox or kick your cable, it would just attach as opposed to ripping your entire console down, which is almost as good as wireless.
Even in the color materials design of the hardware, the cables themselves had sort of a translucent green effect. It really tried to reflect the quality of the user experience. So, as you remember, when you turned on the original Xbox, it had this sort of rotating sphere that felt, out of this world. And so we really wanted the hardware to start to bridge that experience.
The real linchpin for the Xbox's success was Xbox Live, which launched in November of 2002, a full year after the console came out. And it was always designed with online play in mind. I mean, of course it has an Ethernet jack on the back. However, Xbox Live is really what separated this from the rest of the consoles of that generation. It's easy to take this kind of stuff for granted, but there's a lot of legitimate innovations that came with Xbox Live on the original Xbox. That Ethernet jack, provided that you had broadband internet, allowed you to not only play games with other people, but you could even download content to your hard drive for games, or you could chat via voice if you actually had the headset. None of this stuff was really even remotely around for some of those very, very early console gaming experiences. I mean, it was all kludgy and weird, kind of like the Nintendo Switches today. This was a big hit almost immediately. There were over 150,000 people who subscribed in the first week, and over 50 games were available for Xbox Live by the end of 2003. Now the easiest way to tell would be to take a look at the boxes, which show Live Online enabled, and of course Halo 2 is really one of the biggest sellers of the entire Xbox system. By 2003, Microsoft was well underway working on the sequel to the Xbox, the 360, but they still had one final game to release, and of course that was Halo 2, which came out in November of 2004. And this was an absolutely massive seller, with over 8.5 million copies sold. Despite its cliffhanger ending, Halo 2 is widely regarded as one of the best games in the Halo franchise and one of the most influential multiplayer games of all time. Just to give you a good idea of how popular this game was, Halo 2 was still the most popular game on Xbox Live all the way up into 2006, when it was finally dethroned by Gears of War. Yeah, not a bad run. It's impressive that right out of the gate, Microsoft were able to compete with the giants of the space, such as Sega, Nintendo, and Sony. But that was certainly not enough, because their next foray was, let's say, just a little bit more successful. Since the beginning of 2003, Microsoft were hard at work on the next generation, of course being the 360. Now, in large part, this was really kicked off when they had a huge meeting at their campus in Bellevue, Washington, where over 400 game developers attended why they should pick up support for the brand new Xbox. By August of 2003, Microsoft had made the decision to go with ATI to provide the graphics on the Xbox 360, as opposed to Nvidia, who of course did provide the GPU inside the original Xbox. Now, this is largely emblematic of the differences between the original Xbox program and the 360. The original Xbox was largely just made up of components that were pretty much right off the shelf from the PC space. Now, that enabled Microsoft to get a console out into the world fairly quickly, but the downside was that it was very expensive to produce, and they really couldn't customize things and shrink things over the generations to kind of make it cheaper and cheaper. Whereas with the Xbox 360, this was designed to be fully custom from the ground up, and that made a huge difference.
It is midnight Eastern time. Do you know where your Xbox 360 is? Well, it's actually probably right over there. Yes, the moment we've been waiting for is here. Adam is down at Best Buy in the Mojave Desert to witness the sale of the first Xbox 360. Adam?
All right, well, the excitement level just kicked up a couple of notches. We're right here in an impromptu Best Buy shop, and all of the new Xbox 360s are being unloaded.
When the 360 launched in the US on November 22nd, 2005, it was an immediate smash hit. So much so, in fact, that a lot of people assumed that Microsoft were artificially holding back the production to make the line seem longer, when in reality they were just building these things as fast as they could. And by the end of 2005, a mere month and change later, they had sold over 1.5 million of the consoles.
I would say I am probably most proud of the Xbox 360. I just think like the launch lineup, I think the leap from where we went was so massive. We were the first box connected to the TV that streamed Netflix. A lot of people don't remember that, but I remember actually working with Netflix in the early days where they were a mail order DVD business and they were looking for digital distribution, and we were like, hey, what if we put Netflix on our Xbox and allow people to stream movies? And just the games, I mean, we talked about Project Gotham Racing, Call of Duty, KOTOR, Mass Effect, of course the Gears franchise, the Halo franchise, Forza in many ways, got born in that generation. So yeah, I would say that was probably the most special.
The 2005 launch date is important because this was a full year before the Wii as well as the PlayStation 3 had launched. Now, it's easy to think about it today as like, oh, the Xbox was a little bit better, but in reality, this was the beginning of the HD era. Now, in 2005, yeah, there were a few flat screen TVs and HD was just starting to become a thing, but the 360 really was what popularized it in a lot of people's homes. And especially considering that you could get this kind of performance a full year before the PlayStation, well, it didn't get off to a great start for the Sony camp. The gap in release dates meant that Microsoft had a full year to really make sure the 360 was fully established with essentially no competition. Now, yeah, sure, there were a few games that came out for the PS3 launch, just like Resistance, but by that point, the 360 had a ton of great titles like Call of Duty 2, Gears, as well as Fear. Look, there's no doubt that Microsoft beating Sony to the punch paid off in a big way. However, they also had a slightly uncomfortable oversight. The Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death.
Ah, the red rings of doom signal that your Xbox 360 is fried. Microsoft hasn't specified the cause, but users say the console's cooling system just can't take the heat of a lot of play.
So when the hardware would fail, the power button would light up with 3 red lights, which would indicate that you have a major issue. I'm sure Jimmy will do a great job of showing off what that looks like right now. Now, this wasn't necessarily for everyone, so not all Xboxes died, but generally speaking, most of the launch 360s did not last very long. Now, I'll give Microsoft some credit. They did institute a 3-year warranty, and in large part, if you had a red-ringed Xbox 360, you could just ship it back and they would swap it out. But the problem was that the 360, I don't want to say it was rushed, but there were certainly a lot of major issues with the reliability on that first model. Now, there are a few different reasons why. Some people have speculated that it was to do with the thermal paste or maybe the solder that would kind of start to melt after a while. But regardless, that first 360, it didn't last very long. People came up with all kinds of ridiculous remedies to fix this. I know the towel trick was big for a while, and that you would turn on your 360, wrap a towel around it, and I guess the solder or something would reflow and it would work for a little bit. A lot of times the towel trick would only get your 360 to work for like 20 minutes. Like, it was just not a good solution. Even with its technical issues, the Xbox 360 launched actually really strongly, and in large part is because it had a good design.
The modularity thing was really out of necessity to have an affordable product that more people could get from day one. So upgrading hard drives, adding wireless, attaching more controllers, etc. All ways that we can give people choice and really get these game consoles and experiences to more people.
So when the Xbox 360 came out, there were 2 models. The Premium, which cost $400 and came with a massive 20GB hard drive as well as a wireless controller. And then there was the Core model. Now, this was only $300, which made it a really good deal. And while you didn't have a wireless controller and you didn't have a hard drive, you had to deal with memory cards. But this got a lot of people in the door because, again, this was the very first HD console. It was really exciting. And sure, lots of people bought a 360 before realizing they had to buy a hard drive or a bunch of memory cards, but that was fine. Nearly 5 years after the original 360 came out, in 2010 we got this, the Xbox 360 Slim. Now, not only is it significantly smaller, but it had some very key upgrades, like Wi-Fi, built in. Wow. Inside, this was a very simplified version of the original 360. So not only was everything shrunk down, but they had a little bit more of a clever design with the motherboard. They had the CPU and the GPU together on one chip. And generally speaking, this was not only cheaper to manufacture, but in large part it was better across the board compared to the launch 360. The Slim also came in a wide range of different configurations, special editions with different hard drives. And this was the very first Xbox 360 that made it down to a mere $200 price point with the 4GB internal drive. Really, the Slim actually did a very good job of distilling everything that was great about the 360 and putting it into a smaller, cheaper, more reliable package. And then Microsoft decided to create another one. In June of 2013, we got this, the Xbox 360e. Now, this was announced at the same E3 as the original Xbox One, and while the brand new console was super exciting, the E just wasn't. So it's not really that much smaller than the slim Xbox 360. It doesn't really have any additional features. In fact, it has like fewer USB ports. And while I guess the design is a little bit more reminiscent of the Xbox One, I don't know, there just really wasn't a lot going for this guy. Now, in large part, the reason why this was so successful was that Microsoft had a huge head start going into the generation. The original Xbox really pioneered online gaming in any kind of real cohesive way, and all of that came straight over to the 360. So not only could you move your account over, but things like party chat, really solid multiplayer lobbies, the ability to watch Netflix with your friends. There was a lot of stuff that Xbox Live did right immediately out of the gate. Whereas on the PS3 side, well, I mean, PSN existed, and it was free. Another big element to the Xbox 360 success was Xbox Live Arcade. Now, this doesn't sound impressive today. It was an online store where you could purchase and download fairly cheap indie games, but this was a big deal. Back then, there really weren't a lot of indie titles that you could buy for a console. Now, there were a lot of restrictions on these games. They had to have only 200 achievement points, they had to have a demo, they only ran at 720p, which to be fair was actually pretty good for the 360. But the bigger issue, especially with the launch version, was that the games had to be 50 megabytes or less. You know, like smaller than a game that runs on your phone, mostly because it needed to run on a memory card of 64 megabytes. Thankfully, that restriction was loosened after a while, and tons of great games flourished because of it. The interface for the Xbox 360, well, it never was quite as clean as what you got on the PlayStation 3. So there were a few major revisions. First of all, it launched with the blades. So this wasn't a terrible UI. You could go between a few different blades to pick your games or videos or whatever. But where it really came into its own is with the new Xbox experience, where you had a revolutionary new interface with avatars. You could install games to the drive. But really, my personal sweet spot was back when they finally brought out the new Metro UI to the Xbox 360. Yes, I'm sure you remember the wonderful interface, the classic that was known from Windows 8 and the Zune HD. Well, yep, that came to the 360. And it was slow. The Xbox 360 controller has easily gone down as one of the best of all time. Now, when you look at it, it's actually not that big of an upgrade over what you got with the Xbox S controller. However, it got rid of the stupid black and white buttons in favor of actual bumpers. And realistically, this is still the standard for not only the Xbox, but it was the standard for the PC for over a decade. Now, at this point, yes, the Xbox One, I personally do prefer, but this was way, way ahead of the DualShock 3 as far as I'm concerned. Just like the original Xbox, the 360, while it had some bumps along the way, was an incredibly successful console. And I think a lot of people look back at this and think about this really as the sort of sweet spot, the golden age of Xbox, if you will. Now, to be fair, this console generation was really good to pretty much everyone in the space. I mean, Nintendo sold like 100 billion Wiis. The PS3, even though it came off to a very slow start, ended up actually barely surpassing the 360 at the end. But as far as I'm concerned, the Xbox 360 was the real winner of this generation. Not only did it have a bunch of amazing games like Halo 3 and Gears of War, as well as Alan Wake, but what it really did was set the stage for gaming as we know it with huge things such as Xbox Live. However, a few short years later, storm clouds hit the horizon. It was time for the Xbox One. The Xbox One was unveiled at E3 of 2013, and it had a rough go from the start. So first of all, it cost a full $100 more than the PS4, and that was only the first in a series of very questionable decisions, which really made the Xbox One look bad right out of the gate. I remember I was actually there at E3 when they announced this, and man, the crowd's reaction was not too pretty.
Now, have you ever wanted to do more than one thing at a time when you're watching TV? Of course you have.
$500. Kinect. DRM. It looks like a VCR. Actually, that last part was what people said. Now, there were a lot of issues with the way that they announced the Xbox One, but the biggest and by far the most damaging was the DRM. All right, so time to gather around and pay attention because the original policy was, well, confusing to say the least. So to start out with, if you purchased a game, whether it was on disc or digital, as soon as you put it in your Xbox, it would then be permanently tied to your gamer tag. So goodbye, selling that used copy of Modern Warfare 17 on GameStop, because not gonna happen. Oh, and did I mention that your console had to be connected every 24 hours to the internet, otherwise it wouldn't work? Yeah, that was popular. Everyone really loved that. I know Sony had a very clear video on how you could share games on the PS4.
Thanks.
And then there was the Xbox One version of Kinect. Now this guy came with all of the launch Xbox Ones and was a huge reason why it was a full $100 more expensive than the PS4. On top of that, at least based on the initial announcement, this was going to be mandatory for the Xbox. If you didn't have it plugged in, it just wouldn't function, and a lot of the UI was built around Kinect. Now it wasn't all bad, there were certainly advantages to Kinect, and honestly, even after it was sort of phased out, there were a lot of use for it in the PC space because it was a great tracker. But for games, not so helpful unless you're, I don't know, into Just Dance or something. The reaction, as you might imagine, was overwhelmingly negative, and Sony did everything they could to really play up all of the strengths of the PS4, which at the time were many. To give Microsoft some credit, they did reverse a lot of these decisions before the Xbox One actually went on sale. The DRM was the first to go. So the Xbox One does still install games to the hard drive, but all you need to do to make them work is just insert the disc. You take it out, you can give it to someone else, sell it, whatever the case is. On top of that, they did get rid of the requirement to use Kinect, even though it was still bundled with the Xbox for a little while. But all of this being said, the damage was absolutely done, and Microsoft's roughest console generation was just beginning. The original Xbox One launched on November 22nd, 2013 with exactly one option: black. Although, you know what, I'll be completely honest, I actually think that this is a still pretty decent looking console. Spec-wise, the Xbox One shares an almost identical architecture with the PlayStation 4. So they're both AMD based, they both have a 500 gig hard drive, and they both have the same 8-core AMD Jaguar CPU inside, although to give the Xbox a little bit of credit, it is very slightly higher clocked versus the PS4. That, however, is pretty much the end of the good stuff and where the, let's call them, compromises begin. The big problem came down to graphics. Sony pretty early on committed to using GDDR5 memory, which was standard for graphics cards at the time and delivered a ton of bandwidth at the cost of lots of money. which is never good when you're trying to build a console. With most rumors pegging the PS4 at having only 4 gigs of RAM, Microsoft opted to go for that slower but cheaper DDR3 memory and outfit the Xbox One with a full 8 gigabytes of the stuff. This meant that the performance of the Xbox One was inferior to the PS4 in almost every way. Not only did it have slower memory, but they had also dedicated a large portion of their APU to that ESRAM buffer to actually speed up their DDR3, which meant that not only did this have slower memory, but it also was more difficult to develop for because it had that ESRAM buffer that devs had to keep in mind. And to top it all off, because they put that in there, they didn't have enough room for a big GPU like the PS4 did. So it was slower memory, harder to work on, and it was less powerful overall. This haunts the base Xbox to this day. So where the PlayStation 4 was able to run games at a full 1080p in most cases, this guy would usually run games at 720p or 900p. In cases where they were visually the same, a lot of times PS4 games just ran smoother. And all of this put together meant that it was very, very clear that the PS4 was the more powerful console and that the Xbox didn't have really any technical advantage, which was meaningful. Fast forward to August of 2016 and we got the Xbox One S. As the slim version of the original console, this was better in every single way. Not only was it way smaller and it even included an internal power supply versus the giant brick of the One, but on top of that it supports a full 4K out as well as HDR. And then we have the weirdest inclusion in the Xbox One line, the Xbox One S All Digital Edition, or Xbox SAD for short. So this is literally identical to the One S, except that they removed that Ultra HD Blu-ray player and knocked $50 off the price. Although the One S, for the most part, was actually available on sale for less than the SAD guy. But it plays digital games. The biggest advancement for the Xbox One, however, came with the Xbox One X. Now this was teased at E3 at 2016 as Project Scorpio and went on sale in November of 2017.
Well, I think for us, it kind of brought us back to like our original roots. So we built the original Xbox. It was the most powerful console at the time. And sometimes it's like, do you want to be the best-selling product or do you actually want to be the best product? And we defined ourselves as, we knew the competition already had a head start. We actually want to make the best console. And I think that's what we deliberately did with the Xbox. I think if you look at the Xbox One X, the leadership we have there being the most powerful console kind of brought us back to what that roots and foundation was. And that is our passion going forward. We want to continue to innovate and deliver and bring the most powerful, most capable hardware in the console space to our fans.
Priced at $500, the One X is a lot more expensive than the One S, although it's actually very slightly smaller and importantly delivers a lot more power, enough to play a lot of games at a true 4K resolution. The CPU was slightly overclocked on the One X, but the big difference came down to graphics. Gone is the old DDR3 memory and the ESRAM buffer, and in is a full 12 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, as well as a much bigger GPU, which really does enable 4K gaming. Now sure, the PS4 and the PS4 Pro were way better than the One, but the One X definitively took the crown back as this generation's most powerful console.
We're always thinking of the whole thing as a system. The controller is the thing that you hold, and you interact with the controller a lot more than the console itself, because that's kind of on your shelf or under your TV. And so we pay a ton of focus to the design of the controller and making sure that we're always advancing that ergonomically, functionally.
We try not to take away like features or things that people loved about the older controllers. One thing you'll notice is that the thumbsticks are still asymmetrical as they have been over time. And that's something our fans have told us that they love, and that's something that we consider like a core part of our design, and we wouldn't change that.
One place that the Xbox One has lagged behind the competition its entire lifespan is in exclusive games. Stuff like Forza is great year after year, Gears 4 was a good, if a little bit unconventional reboot. However, games such as Halo 5 had decent multiplayer, but on top of that, we had games like Quantum Break, which really fell flat. And while the first Titanfall was a great exclusive on the Xbox One, the follow-up went multi-platform and didn't really perform all that well. Now sure, there are a lot of decent indie titles, but for the most part, there really has not been one killer app this generation on why you should actually buy an Xbox One over a PS4. Now there are some options such as the Halo Master Chief Collection, but not only is this a collection of old games, but they've been broken for years. Like literally it took them like 3 or 4 years to finally get a lot of these multiplayer bugs figured out. So a few years ago, Microsoft included some Xbox 360 backwards compatibility on the One. Now this is not for all games, although at this point it is the vast majority of major 360 titles, and the best part is they just work. So if you have the disc, you put it into the Xbox, and it does have to re-download the game which has been recompiled for the One, but you don't have to pay anything. Microsoft has also brought out a selection of original Xbox games which are playable on the One. Now this is especially impressive considering that the original Xbox is incredibly hard to emulate thanks to that very unusual NVIDIA GPU. I mean, it's the reason why we really still have never had a proper Xbox emulator. Now all of that is paired with the fact that if you're playing on an Xbox One X, you can actually get some major improvements to performance as well as resolution. So a lot of games will run in a 9 times higher resolution, which for a lot of, especially 360 games, can actually scale them to pretty much a full 4K. All of this brings us to the latest addition to the ecosystem, Xbox Game Pass. So this is a Netflix-style subscription service which came out in 2017, and it has been majorly overhauled since then. Look, the Xbox One launch was a complete and total failure, and it robbed Microsoft of a lot of momentum that they had coming from the Xbox 360. When you look at this generation, it is clear that the PlayStation 4 has won, and there's a lot of momentum in the Nintendo camp with the Switch toward the end. However, all that being said, with Microsoft being the underdogs, it's meant that they've tried really hard to make the Xbox One better, and if you look at this console today versus what came out back in 2013, there's a massive difference. Today, we sit at a very interesting time for Xbox. On one hand, lots of people have fond memories of the 360, but on the other, as far as they've come with the Xbox One, it certainly has not been able to measure up to the PS4. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Xbox hasn't released official sales numbers for the One in quite a few years now. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this upcoming console generation is a make or break for Xbox. Either Scarlett does well and it's a huge success, or the Xbox brand gets absorbed into a PC and cloud-based soup of disappointment. Microsoft have been clear. This time around, they're focusing on gaming. One of the key new features will be the addition of a custom SSD. Now this will be standard on all of the Scarlett models, or at least so far as we know, and this proves to be a huge benefit for gamers. Now this generation, we've had a lot of memory, a lot of CPU resources, and so we've been able to have some incredibly detailed open worlds. But the problem has been when it actually comes to load those open worlds, it takes forever on these standard slow hard drives that we have right now. I mean, Red Dead 2 feels like it takes like 2 minutes just to get into the game. And mind you, once you get in, a lot of times load times aren't so bad. But I mean, it's a hugely frustrating experience to like fast travel and wait a minute just for something to load. Whereas with an SSD, instead of waiting that minute, you might only have to wait a couple seconds. The reason that current generation games are so slow to load almost entirely comes down to their very slow laptop-based hard drives. Now back in 2013, this made perfect sense. SSDs back then were incredibly expensive. However, today here in 2019, SSDs are much cheaper. I think it's completely reasonable for Microsoft to ship either a 500 gig or perhaps even a 1 terabyte SSD standard for the Xbox without it being an obscenely expensive console. Although it might be obscenely expensive for other reasons, I just think the SSD is probably pretty reasonable in the grand scheme of things. Then there's the spec. So this generation, we're looking at an absolutely massive increase to the CPU. Now I've already gone in depth on sort of the performance that you might be able to expect on this. You guys can check out that video. But TLDR, the next generation of consoles will have significantly faster CPUs, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 times better on the kind of the conservative estimate. Now the graphics won't be quite as big of a leap, mostly because the current generation of consoles actually have solid graphics. So when you do compare to something like the One X, we should see somewhere around a doubling of GPU horsepower, which is certainly not nothing, but it's nowhere near the same kind of jump that we saw going from like PS3 to PS4. And in large part that's because not only are the graphics fairly up to date, but we're also no longer chasing the teraflop wars. A lot of the basic stuff behind the new AMD Navi GPUs is that they're focusing less on that raw compute number that has always been quoted as teraflops, and more so on features that are specifically focused at gamers. We've got the 8K support, which good luck seeing games running at 8K, but it also does support a full 120 frames per second, as well as variable refresh rates. Then there's also some brand new tech such as ray tracing, which will be up and running on the brand new Xbox Scarlett. Now this is something we actually know a little bit less about, so they've talked about it. However, AMD has kept their cards pretty close to the chest, so really the only good example of ray tracing we have right now is what NVIDIA is doing on the PC space with the RTX line. Now if you're not familiar, ray tracing is actually fairly straightforward. It allows light in game to act pretty much like light acts in real life. It can bounce, it can scatter, as opposed to a lot of current games which require a lot of, shall we say, workarounds to actually get things to look decent. Ray tracing does a lot of that work for you, or at least gives you the tools to. Now the really cool part about this is that when you look at games such as Metro Exodus as well as Battlefield, you can see an early glimpse of what RTX and ray tracing will allow you to do, but as this becomes more and more standard across the next generation of consoles, it should mean that this is going to be coming to everyone, right? If you take all of this and combine it with a lot of these smart moves that Microsoft has been making lately, including supporting not only original Xbox games, but also the 360 and the Xbox One on the Scarlett, and on top of that, the Scarlett should also support most Xbox One accessories like the Elite controller, although maybe not Kinect. That might not actually make the cut. So Microsoft has huge ambitions for their xCloud streaming service, which will allow you to play Xbox games pretty much anywhere, perhaps even with a small little streaming Xbox of their own. Now to be fair, Sony has access to a lot of these building blocks, especially on the hardware side. However, it does seem, at least from the outside, like Microsoft is executing better. They've made tons of smart decisions over the last few years with the Xbox One, all of which are pretty much rolling into Scarlett. And especially considering that Microsoft is putting their giant piles of cash to work by purchasing a lot of studios, it does seem like the Xbox Scarlett should be launching in a much better position than the Xbox One ever was in. All I can say is this: going into 2020, we're in store for an incredibly interesting console war between the PS5, the Xbox Scarlett, and especially considering that Nintendo hasn't even started talking about what they're doing next generation, I'm really, really amped. It's a very, very good time to be a gamer.